to Ethiopia Today, your gateway to insightful stories and perspectives shaping Ethiopia and beyond. From cultural explorations to in-depth coverage of pressing issues, we delve into the nation's heart, celebrating its diversity, resilience, and progress. Join us as we explore this compelling narrative, celebrating the diverse voices and impactful stories that define our present and inspire our future. Unveiling Ethiopia's southern route, the perils and promises of migration. You have no phone, no control, and that's when abuse can start. This ongoing series explores the humanitarian implications of South-South migration. Although South-South migration flows are larger than the numbers of people heading south to north, with all the inherent risks of undocumented travel, these cross-border, intra-regional journeys tend to be neglected by governments and aid agencies, says the new humanitarian editor. Sometime in October last year, a truck stopped on a quiet road in northern Malawi's Ntangatanga forest and offloaded 29 bodies. They had suffocated in the back of the vehicle and were hastily buried in shallow graves. The dead were Ethiopian men, aged between 25 and 40, victims of a lucrative transnational smuggling network that funnels tens of thousands of people into southern Africa each year, with little regard for their safety. The deceased, still to be identified, had probably come from the densely populated rural Kembata and Hadia zones of the central Ethiopia region. They had entrusted their lives to an intricate, often abusive, system of people transporters. Their goal had simply been to reach South Africa, find work, and change the economic fortunes of their families. There have been several other incidents of mass fatalities on the various routes smugglers use to push people south, but most are far less visible. What makes them Ntangatanga Malawi case unusual is the sheer number of dead. What is also noteworthy is that among the 8 people in court on manslaughter and people trafficking charges is the alleged owner of the truck, the stepson of a former president of Malawi. The southern route to South Africa is one of 3 major migration corridors transporting people from the Horn of Africa. But unlike the 2 better-known routes, going east to the Gulf states, or north to Europe, it is both sketchily documented and poorly understood. As a result, the dynamics and casualties of this covert business tend to be overlooked by migration experts, aid agencies, and government authorities. This may stem from the fact that travel along the southern route encompasses so-called South-South movements, which may be less of a priority for donor governments of the global north. Ayla Bonfilio of the Mixed Migration Center, MMC, a policy think tank, told the New Humanitarian. As a result, it's challenging to build support for comprehensive data and research along this route. Over the last few months, a team of reporters from the New Humanitarian, based in Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa, key hubs of the southern route, have been on the ground talking to former smugglers, would-be migrants, and migrant researchers. The emerging picture is of a booming organized crime business that is having a growing political and economic impact in countries along the corridor's path. As the New Humanitarian investigation reveals, it's difficult to gauge how many use the route to arrive in South Africa, one of the continent's more developed economies. The volume of people traveling along it is believed to be larger than those taking the northern route to Europe, but much less than those heading from the Horn of Africa to the Gulf states. Many, perhaps most, of the undocumented Ethiopians and Somalis that make it to South Africa apply for asylum. In the first 6 months of this year, just over 23,000 Ethiopians and 2,600 Somalis sought asylum in South Africa, according to the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR. This suggests the number of people traveling the southern route annually could be approaching 50,000. The hazards of the journey are considerable. To avoid detection, travelers can be packed in airless fuel tankers and shipping containers or march for days on detours through forests and national parks. There is also a precarious sea route from Kenya and Somalia to Mozambique, and onto South Africa by road. There is little food along the way, and those who fall sick are usually abandoned. There is also an ever-present threat of violence or extortion, typically a sudden demand for more money, as well as the danger of being kidnapped by criminal gangs or rival smuggling networks. That smugglers commonly refer to migrants as goods underlines just how dehumanizing the business is. With the spike in jihadist threats across eastern and southern Africa, borders have become more securitized and travel documents harder to obtain. That has encouraged clandestine migration and the expansion of the lucrative smuggling economy. Verified migrant deaths in Africa are among the highest in the world, a reflection of the inherent dangers of irregular movement. The road trip south can take up to 6 months to complete, and is expensive. It costs an average of roughly $4,800 per person, compared to $700 to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, according to the UN's migration agency, IOM. But these are not fixed rates. Generally, the more money paid, the faster the travel and the greater insulation against the risks. Those making the journeys are overwhelmingly young men from southern Ethiopia and urban Somalia seeking to escape the lack of opportunities at home. The goal is to find work, typically in the small informal corner shops known as spazas, a retail niche in which Ethiopian and Somali immigrants excel. They not only employ the new arrivals, but, after a few years of work, the community will typically help these young men set up their own businesses. The travel is voluntary, supported and sponsored by the young men's families, or by their connections in South Africa. Over the last 2 decades, the emigration trail has become a tradition in the Zena and teshome areas. There's no family in Hadia that doesn't have a person here, said Johannes Habib, chair of the Ethiopian business community in South Africa. They are escaping poverty, and we Ethiopians work hard. He reckons there are tens of thousands of Ethiopian-owned spaza shops in South Africa. The journey's huge cost is counted as an investment by families. The odyssey begins with a visit to a local agent of one of the smuggling networks, and the subsequent sale of land and livestock, or taking out of a loan, to fund a son's trip. Payments are usually staggered, partly as leverage to try and ensure the travel to South Africa is completed. Ethiopian migration researcher Yordanos Estefanos told the New Humanitarian. The benefits are tangible and publicly visible in the towns of Kembata and Hadia zones, as Estefanos noted. Remittances pay for the new houses, the farm equipment, the school fees, and lavish weddings. Upward mobility is the reward for having a brave and dutiful son. Migration is now socially embedded, Estefanos told the New Humanitarian. Facebook posts and videos from the men in South Africa all paint a very rosy picture, and even pastors in some churches advocated. That works to allay the fears in the minds of the families. The young men themselves, in a mix of bravado and fatalism, see the risks as worthwhile, if they can make it, he added. The smuggling networks are decentralized and extremely flexible, routes constantly change depending on law enforcement pressure. A network will be run by a chief smuggler, usually based in Kenya, who outsources to connections in each country. By controlling payments along the corridor, they retain a measure of influence. But that sway begins to fade once the journey gets underway. As a migrant, you're traveling in a group, in the hands of smugglers. An Ethiopian community worker who supports detained migrants told the New Humanitarian, asking not to be named. You have no phone, no control, and that's when abuse can start. There is a lot of deception used by the smugglers over the travel process, said Lucy Msk from the IAM office in Tanzania. They will say the journey is safe, that it will take only a few weeks, but the reality is very different. Moyale is a bustling town on the Ethiopia-Kenya border that serves as a base for several smuggling networks. A smooth highway cuts through the northeastern drylands ending in the capital, Nairobi. But most migrants are taken instead in groups through the bush, using so-called ponya, rat routes, to avoid checkpoints. They usually join the main road around the town of Isiolo. Exhausted, they're packed into vehicles, sometimes hidden among livestock, for the final 270-kilometer leg to Nairobi. As Ethiopian migrants are conspicuous by their features, an absence of documentation, and generally an inability to speak Kiswahili, bribes are paid when police are encountered along the way. Densely populated Kiamako, in Nairobi's Madari informal settlement, is just one of several hard-scrabble neighborhoods where migrants are hidden. The community is largely Borana and Borji ethnic groups that straddle the Ethiopia-Kenya border and tend to provide the safe houses that are a key link in the smuggling chain. New arrivals are crammed into apartment rooms or unsanitary shed-like structures, locked from the outside. With never enough food or water, they can be forced to wait for weeks, even months, until the next stage of the journey is arranged. There can also be an element of trafficking, with the migrants forced to work in construction or slaughterhouses to maximize the smugglers' profits, community leaders told the New Humanitarian. "It's like a mafia network," said George Mahia, coordinator of the Kiamako Community Social Justice Center. "It's very hard to know who the top bosses are, but at the lower echelons, we know who's involved, and it has become normalized." Smugglers pay around $50 to rent a room where migrants are kept and sparingly fed. "That's a lot of money around here," noted Mahia. Police, believed to have a good idea where some of the safe houses are, hesitate to get involved until the clamor from neighbors gets too much. Even then, although the migrants may be detained and deported, the smugglers themselves seem to evade prosecution. "Kenya has very strict anti-trafficking laws, but we don't convict the facilitators," said migration lawyer Fabian Oiri. "Why do we stop at just rescuing the victims and not go after the big shots? There's something there that doesn't meet the eye." The implication of police complicity was denied by George Kiplagat, the commanding officer at Moyale Station. "This is an organized crime. These people hide their identities," he told the New Humanitarian. "Despite the investigative powers of the police, it's very hard to find the ringleaders," he added. Tanzania is the next leg of the journey, but due to aggressive policing, it has become something of a choke point. Irregular entry is treated as a criminal offense, and despite periodic mass deportations, around 3,000 Ethiopian migrants are currently in detention in jails and police cells across the country. But that hasn't stopped the travel south. As in much of the world, borders here are an abstract notion for communities that live alongside them. Locals regularly cross informally, bypassing the authorities, and see the business opportunities in helping others do the same, the MMC's Bonfilio told the New Humanitarian. The Ethiopians who died in the truck in Malawi's Mtangatanga forest had crossed illegally from Tanzania. The vehicle's likely destination was the Dzaleka refugee camp, just outside the Malawian capital, Lilongwe. It's more like a small village than a refugee settlement, its center a hive of small shops and bars. It's also a hub for migration and trafficking, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. But a handful of relatively large houses look out of place in Dzaleka's narrow lanes. These are allegedly the homes of the 10 or so Ethiopian-run smuggling syndicates. Double metal gates and high walls topped with razor wire and floodlights conceal inner compounds, far from the standard 1 or 2 room refugee accommodation. Smart, street-casual young Ethiopian men drive 4x4s and Golf GTIs, some parked discreetly at a petrol station outside the camp. Although they may own bars and businesses in Dzaleka, or rent land and farm, the refugees the New Humanitarian interviewed claimed it was all a front for smuggling, the real money maker. They introduce themselves as businessmen, but we know what they do, said an Ethiopian professional working in Lilongwe, who asked not to be named for safety reasons. They are behind the scenes, working the phones and controlling the networks. They use Congolese and Burundian refugees to do the work, and Malawians who can travel unnoticed. A senior crime prevention expert, who also asked not to be named given the sensitivity of his work, said he knows of one top smuggler who runs a fleet of 18 vehicles shuttling migrants from the Tanzanian border to Dzaleka, making $2,500 per vehicle per trip. Migrants arriving in Dzaleka are kept in houses rented from refugees. There, they wait, sometimes for months, until connections have been arranged and payments received for the next step of the journey, usually to Mozambique and then on to South Africa. The New Humanitarian spoke to 2 refugees hired by one of the Dzaleka syndicates to feed and keep an eye on the arriving migrants. They described cramped conditions in a chain of small houses, with threadbare mats covering hard floors, just 2 meals a day, and occasional violence. The abuse is usually a punishment for the failure to pay the next installment, normally sent via mobile money. "The smugglers tell us, 'Don't feed that guy, or they beat him,'" said one of the two men. "They don't have any remorse, they only care about the money." Yet extremely poor treatment, or too long a delay, can occasionally result in migrants switching, with the help of their families, to better performing syndicates. That can cause conflict both in Dzaleka and South Africa, said Estefanos. Retaliation is usually in the form of a tip-off to the police about a rival network's next border run. The clandestine nature of the business means it's hard to assess how many migrants move through Dzaleka. The Ethiopian professional believes a top smuggler can transport 40 to 70 people a month. The men looking after the migrants said the number is far higher, in the hundreds. The scale of the money generated is deeply corrupting. Law enforcement and immigration officials provide the syndicates with seemingly cast-iron protection and impunity, a business model built on officialdom's greed. A police officer recently posted to Dzaleka's small station said everyone in his training college was aware of the financial opportunities, in the form of payoffs, the camp represented. Although it was known to be a smuggling hub, his commanding officers preferred them to focus on the regular caseload of theft and domestic violence, he told the New Humanitarian, speaking on condition of anonymity. In September, more than 100 undocumented Ethiopians were found by South African police crammed into a house in Primrose, an old suburb east of Johannesburg. They were living in appalling conditions, and some were dehydrated and malnourished. They had been packed in that house, with one toilet and buckets, and they hadn't been allowed to leave, a policeman at Primrose Station told the New Humanitarian, and asked not to be named as he wasn't authorized to speak to the media. The residential home was a collection center for new arrivals. From similar safe houses in Johannesburg, migrants are moved to less crowded dorms until the final arrangements are made. Then it's a rendezvous at a McDonald's, or a similarly nondescript meeting point, and a handover to a friend, relative, or sponsor. At that point, the migrants would likely think their long and difficult journey is over. However, South Africa itself represents a whole new set of burdens, beyond the hardships of the road. That includes rising anti-foreign African sentiment, a staggering crime rate, a stuttering economy, and a dysfunctional Department of Home Affairs that frustrates asylum applications. And the future may not be any easier. A recent white paper sets out the government's far-reaching plans to clamp down on economic migration as part of a radical overhaul of refugee policy. Habib, the chair of the Ethiopian business community, told the New Humanitarian that in the 18 years he has lived in the country, he has never tried to bring anyone from his home area of Hosanna. Although he is sympathetic to the drivers of migration, there is no safety here, he said, a reference to both the general insecurity and rising Afrophobia. His concern right now is focused on a spate of recent attacks on spaza shops led by the populist Dudula movement, which aims to register as a political party in time for next year's election. None of these challenges are ever mentioned by the smuggling networks to prospective migrants or their families as they prepare to gamble on the journey south. But even if it were, the young men wouldn't pay attention, said Estefanos. Their attitude is, however tough life may be in South Africa, it's still better than poverty at home. To sum up, in tracing the intricate web of migration from Ethiopia to South Africa, it becomes starkly evident that this journey, fraught with peril and exploitation, reflects a confluence of desperation and aspiration. The tragic loss of lives along the southern route underscores the urgent need for multifaceted interventions, spanning regional cooperation, policy overhaul, and humanitarian action. The neglect of South-South migration by governments and aid agencies has led to the unchecked proliferation of smuggling networks, perpetuating a cycle of vulnerability and exploitation. The perils faced by migrants, from suffocation in trucks to extortion, violence, and dehumanization, demand immediate attention and decisive action. The economic aspirations that drive these journeys cannot be overlooked. South Africa must grapple with the economic potential and socio-political impact of these arrivals. The contribution of economic migrants to the fabric of South African society, particularly in the establishment of businesses and the workforce, is undeniable. However, this narrative of migration is also intricately entwined with risks, systemic vulnerabilities, and criminality that demand redress. Enhanced collaboration between countries along the migration corridor is imperative to stem the tide of human suffering and exploitation. Critical reforms are necessary, encompassing both stringent law enforcement against smuggling networks and comprehensive support mechanisms for migrants. Strengthening legal pathways, improving border controls without compromising human rights, and providing viable alternatives to irregular migration are pivotal steps in addressing this humanitarian crisis. Additionally, confronting rising sentiments of anti-foreign African sentiment demands a concerted effort from both government and civil society. Safeguarding the rights and dignity of migrants within South Africa requires a multifaceted approach, inclusive of public awareness campaigns, community integration efforts, and policy frameworks fostering inclusivity. Ultimately, the narrative of migration from Ethiopia to South Africa cannot solely be viewed through the lens of tragedy and exploitation. It's a narrative woven with aspirations for a better life and economic prosperity. Channeling these aspirations through safe, legal, and dignified pathways is not just a moral imperative but a strategic investment in fostering regional stability and prosperity. Thank you for joining us on Ethiopia Today. If you found this video informative or thought-provoking, don't forget to hit the like button below. Sharing is caring, so feel free to share this content with friends and family who might find it valuable. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest releases. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment down below. Your engagement fuels our journey of discovery. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and keep exploring with Ethiopia Today.